All right, guys, here we go. Talking about 10-2 to 10-4, the Vietnam War era here. So, combatants in Vietnam is pretty straightforward. On the one side, you've got the U.S. forces and the South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN or the South Vietnamese Army, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, all the same thing there, plus the U.S. forces there, Democratic and American, of course. On the other side, you've got the communists, the Viet Cong, a little bit more guerrilla, a little less organized. And the People's Army of Vietnam, the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, again, all the same thing there with those acronyms. So, escalation after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. You've got President Johnson. He's authorizing all sorts of escalation with, for example, sending troops in and airstrikes. Operation Rolling Thunder here, March of 65. Johnson wants to bomb the daylights out of North Vietnam, really just try and show our military superiority and bomb them into submission and cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which supplies the South, or the Viet Cong in the South. It does not work, and thus more American troops are going to be sent. General Westmoreland there, he's the major commander in Vietnam at this point. He and Secretary of Defense McNamara, they want to Americanize the war. In other words, they want the U.S. to kind of take more of an active role in the effort. Again, this would be escalation at its finest. So, new weapons kind of here being used to an extent. That's going to impact the environment. You can see on the right the pictures there. Napalm, it's gasoline, but it's jelly, so it's going to stick a little bit more. Burn. It's going to be you can burn on water, for instance. Going to airdrop this in typically most of the time, trying to take out the cover, the jungle and so forth. Problem that you have with the Viet Cong and so forth is that they use the cover in the jungle to hide, and it's very effective. So napalm plus Agent Orange, which is an herbicide that's going to kill and defoliate the forests, kill the leaves and stuff. You'll theoretically be able to see the Viet Cong a little bit easier, and thus be able to fight them a little bit easier with these two new weapons. Problem with Agent Orange, apart from the ecological effects where entire forests are killed and so forth, pretty harmful to humans, American, Vietnamese, etc. We're talking birth effects, cancer, stuff like that. So you can see in the pictures here a little bit some issues going on here. You can see the effects of Agent Orange, the human cost and the ecological cost there. Justified or not, that's kind of up to you guys to decide, really. So Viet Cong strategies, why they're such a tough enemy to fight. Viet Cong, they're not doing that traditional war thing. It's more of a war of attrition where they're trying to outlast the Americans, bleed them dry until the Americans decide, okay, you know what, I've had enough, it's not worth it. They're going to do this, ambushes, sneak attacks, attacks at night, booby traps, and they're really only going to have a direct confrontation when they're pretty confident they're going to be able to win because they just don't have the military muscle to fight head-to-head with the Americans, thus the Viet Cong guerrilla warfare strategies and the war of attrition concept. Soldiers for the U.S., you can see a drastic escalation from 65 to 67 in terms of dead. In 2 years, you've got near 15,500 people, American soldiers dying. So in just 2 years, massive escalation, a lot of soldiers being sent over, and thus a lot more dying. A lot of these soldiers don't really want to be there, but they're drafted, so they have to. The problem with the South Vietnamese is that, yes, they're technically our allies, but a lot of the average villagers, they don't really want the U.S. to be there or want them to win. Thus, they kind of aid the Viet Cong and so forth. And how do you defeat these guerrilla warfare tactics when you can't find your enemy? On top of that, you got the Viet Cong mixing in with South Vietnamese civilians. That makes it much, much tougher. So therefore, you got not only the soldiers, but Americans back home questioning the war a little bit too. The anti-war movement, it's going to be pretty simple here. You've got hawks and doves. Hawks, much more aggressive bird, thus kind of why they're the more aggressive people in support of the war. Typically more conservative, like more Republicans at this time period. Not exclusively, but typically. Strongly believing in containment. You have to stop communism where it is. And they're like, you know what? The money cost, the human lives cost, it is what it is. You got to stop communism. Johnson, Nixon, and others kind of would fall into that category, whereas the doves say that the war strategically and morally is probably not easily fought or won, and that, hey, this is really between Vietnam, North and South. We shouldn't be there. Liberal students, pacifists, others. You have Congress people holding public hearings in the late 60s to openly criticize the war. So they're against the war here. You've got the Kennedys, both of them, Martin Luther King Jr., Eugene McCarthy, etc., are probably more likely to be anti-war here and be doves. It's also a living room war. The television allows people to see what's going on. You can see the picture there, some pretty nasty images. People get to see the body bags, the casualties, the suffering of the troops on both sides. So the living room war kind of comes into play here, and that people now get to see the Vietnam War in person in the context of seeing it through their television screen and what's actually going on, as opposed to hearing it secondhand, using their imaginations, news broadcasts on the radio, newspapers, etc. And this is going to slowly wear people down, and they're going to see all this negativity, and their minds are going to start turning towards negative thoughts regarding the war. So next up here, we've got to talk about the draft briefly. The draft is instituted selective service, 1.5 million men brought in during the Vietnam War. Problem is it's forced military service, and people don't tend to like to be forced into that sort of thing, especially when you could lose your life. It is a little bit discriminatory against the poor and minority. You have a lot more of them drafted than more affluent people. Part of this is because college students and people with families get deferments. People with good jobs, so to speak, could get deferments and so forth. And as a result of the war becoming increasingly unpopular, by 1965, most of the soldiers in Vietnam, they're draftees. They don't really want to be there, but they don't have a choice. In order to combat the alleged inconsistencies and discrimination and so forth, and unfairness of the draft lottery is instituted, in which they basically say, okay, everybody, your birthday is assigned to a number, and we're going to just pull numbers randomly. And then if we pull your number, you and everybody that shares your birthday, for instance, will then be drafted. See, it's more fair kind of thing. Ways out of the draft: if you're going to college, if you have a medical reason and can't pass a test for some reason, or if you have an important higher level job, a teacher, maybe a priest, something like that, something that's going to be more vital. You could have religious reasons. You could flee the country as well. The lottery draft is also going to hopefully prevent the abuse of these things here, because in large part, people really don't want to go, and so they're going to try and find any way out that they can, and the draft lottery is going to theoretically make that a little bit fair, so people aren't as likely to bail on the draft here. Protests on college campuses, as the war goes on, it's going to start out small, but protests are going to grow increasingly larger. Students for Democratic Society, founded in 1960 at Michigan, so really early on. They want to do teach-ins where they basically have people going around and they talk about different things about the war and teach people different aspects of it and demonstrations against the war, etc. You do have young people with money. They tend to be a little more open with their protests, a little bit more seen in the public eye, probably in large part because they're not as likely to be off to war. They're able to, if they're at college, they're able to think more about it as opposed to being directly affected by it. So they're able to think and protest a little bit more openly. You got Michigan here where there's some teach-ins. You got Cal Berkeley there. You got Wisconsin where there's riots. You got Columbia. So all over the place. And then eventually here, as the war starts to wind down a little bit, kind of jumping ahead here, 26th Amendment is passed. This is going to allow 18-year-olds the right to vote. It used to be 21. There were some protests that, hey, if you can go and fight for your country and die for your country, you should be able to vote and have a say in what it does. So that's a big reason why this gets passed here. Meanwhile, the credibility gap widens. Johnson and the government is telling people this and they're telling people that about how the war is going, it's going well, etc. And they're kind of like the cartoon here shows, they're kind of covering up the truth about Vietnam. So as the war goes on, people are going to question what the government's telling more and more. And there's going to be some evidence coming up here later that the government was, if not directly lying to people, at least misleading or withholding some of the truth. So the credibility gap is going to widen as the war continues on here. And moving on here now into 1968 a little bit, we've got the Tet Offensive in the early part of the year here. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, they've agreed to a ceasefire to celebrate the New Year holiday of Tet with the South Vietnamese, and then, of course, the Americans are involved there. They have this major offensive. You can see all the battles there on the right-hand side of the screen in the map there. Against the South Vietnamese Army and the U.S. forces, attack major cities, basically what would amount to state capitals, supply depots, bases, etc. The thing with this is that the North Vietnamese weren't supposed to be able to do this sort of thing. And Johnson and the government is telling, they can't do this. They're not able to. The war is going well, blah, 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 kind of continuing that vein. The U.S. kind of wins on the ground, but the problem is now that the people back home through the television and so forth, they see that the North Vietnamese are actually able to do exactly what Johnson and the government were telling them they weren't able to. Thus, they kind of lose a little heart for the war and they lose a little trust in the government. Rolling on here, because of Johnson's increasing unpopularity, in 68, he decides not to run for re-election. The Tet Offensive is definitely going to play into that. So he's not going for re-election, even though he's going to try and negotiate a settlement in Vietnam. Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war candidate, you can see him there on the right by Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of President John F. Kennedy. They're going to be the front runners. Kennedy's going to emerge as probably the better candidate, even so. The problem is, after Martin Luther King was assassinated about 2 months later, Robert Kennedy is going to be assassinated as well. Would have been a pretty strong candidate, and this is going to throw the Democrats in turmoil here a little bit. So at the Democratic National Convention, where they try and decide, hey, we want this person to run for president for our party, it's located in Chicago. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president of Johnson, is chosen. He hasn't even entered a primary where they kind of vote, hey, and which state, who they want for their candidate. He didn't even enter any, so his name's not really in the ring, and he gets chosen, and people are like, what? He's not even running here in a sense, and you chose him. It creates tension, chaos, disagreement in the Democratic convention and party. So that's not going to be good for them. On top of that, outside of the convention hall, out in Chicago, you've got what amounts to a police riot where protesters are protesting the Vietnam War, civil rights, etc. And the police, not everybody, but a good chunk of the police start essentially just beating and rioting the protesters, painting a pretty negative image of the Democrats and America in general. Which is going to then work in Nixon's favor here. Richard Nixon, we talked a little bit about him in the past. He's going to run against Humphrey here. He's going to, win fairly handily. George Wallace, governor from the South, he's going to help Nixon out, and he's going to pull some votes away from Humphrey, so that's nice for Nixon. Nixon's like, hey, silent majority here. What he means by that is, yeah, there's plenty of people out there saying this and they're saying that publicly and openly, but who's really voting here is the big groups, the masses that they don't go out regularly and talk and protest and support or protest against something. They're just kind of at home following along, and yet they still show up and vote. That's who he says helps him get elected in particular. Kind of like President Trump and Hillary Clinton, the 2016 election, when Trump was supposed to have no shot. There's a lot of people that showed up even though they weren't vocally voicing their support. Kind of the same concept here with Nixon, loosely anyways. Nixon wants to get out of the war with Vietnamization. Peace talks kind of stall. He wants to work on giving control of the war to the South Vietnamese army while getting U.S. troops out of it. So it's a gradual plan, going to hand control over the South Vietnamese, which kind of makes sense. It's their war to a degree. So problem is he's going to escalate the war a little bit by the invasion of Cambodia. He's been secretly bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail to try and cut off supplies to the Viet Cong and so forth. Does not work overly well. But to try and cut supplies and so forth. So he invades Cambodia, which is not a big thing as far as people are concerned, because yes, he's targeting Viet Cong bases trying to win the war, but he's now invading somewhere else. Now he's escalating a very unpopular war. This is going to lead to protests at universities like Kent State, Jackson State, where a couple of students are going to be killed each, 4 at Kent State and Jackson State. So the war is escalating still, as is the response to it, and it's not looking too good. The My Lai massacre is going to also further add fuel to the anti-war stuff here, because a group of Americans massacred a couple hundred innocent Vietnamese civilians, thus painting a negative picture for the U.S. and further fueling the anti-war sentiment. Pentagon Papers are going to be released shortly thereafter, showing that the government has been lying to the American people, at least all the way back since Truman, so for 20 plus years, and this is going to even further heighten the distrust of the government and turn people away from the war. Nixon is going to be reelected pretty easily in 1972, however, and then he's going to move for the Paris Peace Accords in 73. It's going to establish a ceasefire and the U.S. getting out of Vietnam. Prisoners of war will be released, and this will kind of fully shift. This will Vietnamize the war, and South Vietnam will then take over the war here. Saigon, when they officially fall, the capital of South Vietnam, they're going to fall to communism. Containment does not work here. Cambodia and Laos are going to fall to communism, kind of like the domino theory. So this is the official end of the war for the U.S. anyways. The effects you can see here, 58,000 dead, a lot of money spent. Congress passes the War Powers Act to restrict the president's abilities here to wage war without congressional approval. And then you've got veterans here that are going to be treated pretty poorly compared to other wars, mainly due to all the media negative attention they get. The Vietnamese, 3 million dead. Communists target and kill others. Even though today, though, we are on pretty good terms with Vietnam, even though they're communists, we're not like Johnson. He's black and white. Only communist that's good is a dead one. So that's it. If you guys have questions, send me an email.